All right, let's do an overview now of shoulder pain. Shoulder pain is something, it's not like when I was in school I thought, oh, I'm going to treat a lot of shoulder pain. I'm really into that. But it's something that we see all the time, and it's something that we're generally very good at. I'm going to go as far as to say we're very good at treating shoulder pain, especially something like frozen shoulder. So we're going to do an overview here, and then you'll see in another video where we'll actually do a bit of a demo in terms of how we treat it. The nice thing about it is it's pretty straightforward what we do, and often we see very good results. So let's get into our overview, and we'll see what we do about shoulder pain in practice. Here's what we've got for our notes. We see shoulder pain, and again, we see a lot of the same causes that we've seen before. We see acute trauma. This is actually, well, no, this is actually does play a significant role because often, maybe not acute trauma, but acute trauma at some point in the past, previous traumas, maybe a better way to say it, is almost always a cause of frozen shoulder. Most of what we see when people talk about shoulder pain is frozen shoulder. If they talk about shoulder pain and then you say, where does it hurt, and they point to the traps, that's more of what we saw in our previous video. That's neck and cervical pain. But here we see actual pain in the shoulder, diffuse. Usually it's diffuse with localized areas of tension, so they'll say it hurts here, and they'll be able to point to a few particular places, but it's more of a general ache, general pain. Often it is relieved or at least improved by movement and warmth. There will be tenderness, and pretty much this is really what characterizes frozen shoulder. We see restricted range of motion. Often this gives us that ability where, or that an inability to take the shoulder and really go beyond 90 degrees. So I usually will have them do the test, and they'll lift the shoulder up, and when we get to right about here, this is when they start to do this part. So this tells us that they're pretty limited in the rest of that abduction motion. And we see that a little bit in forward flexion as well, but it's a little less pronounced. Usually they get to 90 and there's pain. They don't usually do this as much. That's a pretty characteristic frozen shoulder pattern. What do we do to treat it? We do cupping and we do trigger point, and that is usually enough in most uncomplicated cases to do it. The more the trauma in the past, the harder it might be to actually make some changes in the joint. But usually when we go into the history, they'll say, oh yeah, I had a bit of an injury. And it's usually a bit of an injury. And since then it never really healed, and then I just lost use of it. And the nice thing about it is the shoulder, and the shoulder is one of our most mobile joints. When there's a trauma or an injury, the muscles get tight to protect the joint. That's why muscles get tight around a joint. It's to protect the joint. It's more important to keep the joint used at all than it is to have some restriction. So the restricted motion is usually a physiological compensation to try to protect the joint. The nice thing about most cases of frozen shoulder is that the joint no longer needs to be protected. So we can actually be fairly direct, I don't use the word aggressive, but fairly direct in what we do with our cupping and our trigger point, because as we release these muscles, the joint goes back into a full, sometimes all the way full, or at least more full range of motion. Now that's our frozen shoulder. Shoulder pain, of course, like the other patterns we've seen, can be caused by liver-qi stagnation. That's exactly what we saw before, chronic stress and tension. And this can lead to shoulder pain. It's more often neck and upper neck shoulder pain, but we can see these radiating into the head and neck. We're going to have headaches, muscle tension. This is usually really not a shoulder condition, but we include it here for completion's sake. This one, though, deficiency of qi in blood, or sciatica coming next. Deficiency of qi in blood is very common in patterns of shoulder pain. If it's not frozen shoulder, and usually you know this by the restricted range of motion, is pretty characteristic. If it's not frozen shoulder, most of the rest of the cases we see are deficiency of qi in blood, resulting in, we saw this in our previous videos, a failure of qi in blood to nourish the joints. We see this when, for whatever reason, people aren't getting enough proteins and fats, and maybe to some degree vitamin C, some other micronutrients, but usually it's proteins, it's macronutrients, proteins and fats. We do see this insidious onset joint pain. So these are the patients that say, my shoulders hurt, and I don't exactly know why. Did you have a previous injury? No, there's not really a history of injury, but they ache, and they'll have some not quite restricted range of motion, but say, yeah, it hurts a little more when I do this, or we might here and there, it cracks and it pops a little bit. That's usually characteristic of deficiency in qi in blood. In these cases, really in contrast to our above cases here, which almost always resolve as we use cupping and trigger point and just reestablish the smooth flow of qi and blood, and we bring old obstructions, we bring those back into harmony. Here, you really have to treat the qi and blood to build back the joint. You can do acupuncture and cupping, and they're helpful, but they will not be able to resolve it. So for example, in this case, cupping and trigger point often do treat the cause because the cause is a pre-existing obstruction that we can unblock and return to smooth function. With deficiency of qi and blood, we've got to bring back qi and blood if we want the joint to be nourished, and return to a state of health. It's actually pretty uncomplicated what we do with shoulder pain, and I like to talk about it because it's something we generally do quite well with. We'll wrap up our shoulder pain there, and we're going to look at sciatic pain in our next video.